Hi, Richard Duffy from SMB Solutions, and I'd like to welcome you to our second session in our Installing SAP Business One 9.2 series of training videos. So in our first video, we went through the process of getting SAP Business One up and running on your SQL Server. So the next step is to get the client installed. Now you'll recall that we did actually install the client on the server as well, but obviously you're going to be in a situation where you're going to need to go and deploy the client to all the different workstations that you have as part of your implementation. You may also be in a situation where you're using terminal services and you need to deploy the client in a terminal services environment. You might also then have to deploy and configure the SAP Business One browser client. So we're going to cover all three of those scenarios, but the scenario of installing SAP Business One, getting the client running on terminal server, is not that much different to what's going to happen on a standard workstation. So I'm going to kind of do those two things simultaneously. So right now I have got my terminal server machine, or as it's now known, remote desktop services. So I've got my remote desktop services application host running here, and if I open up my file explorer, you'll recall that we installed the SAP Business One on a server called SQL. So if I go out onto the network and I look at that server, you'll see that we have our shared folder set up. So this was done during the server installation. This was one of the steps. If you go in and you have a look inside here, you'll see that there is a whole range of components in here, and this is designed specifically so that you can go to each workstation and access this shared folder over the network and then run the installation from this shared folder. Now, one of the things that I always like to do is I always like to map this shared folder to a drive letter. Right, because sometimes it makes it just easier for people to remember the drive letter. And funnily enough, I allocate the drive letter S to this particular folder. So if we go and have a look here, you'll see right now I've only got my drive C and my drive D. So if I go back here, I right click and I'm just going to say map network drive, and I will pick drive S, and I'll tell the system to reconnect its sign in, and then I'll say finish. So now I have my S drive, and that's there ready to rock and roll. So if I was just going to go and run this installation on a normal workstation, well, what would I do? I would decide whether or not I'm going to install the 64-bit client or the 32-bit client, and then I would go into the appropriate folder. Let's say we're going to install the 64-bit client, and I would find the setup program. I would right click on it and I would say run as administrator. Alright, so that's fine, but this machine that I'm on right now is actually my terminal services or my remote desktop services host. So I don't want to run the setup this way. I want to run it using the special application install process in terminal services. I've got to get over saying terminal services. It's remote desktop services, Richard. So how do I do that? Well, if you go and you open up your control panel and you look at your control panel and you look at your large icons, all right, one of the things that you will see here is that you have this function which is install application on remote desktop. So what this does is it sets the machine up in such a way that as this installation is being run, all of the registry changes that are made and all those things that are specific to your user profile get captured, and then each time a new user logs on, they get their own set or their own copy of those changes. So that's how terminal services manages all of those different users. But anyway, so I go here and I say install application on the remote desktop, and then I'll say next, And what I'll do is I'll just browse out to that location, and this is where having that S drive makes things a little bit easier. I go to my client 64 and I choose my setup, and then I'll say OK, and then I'll say next. And so what's going to happen now is my SAP Business One client installer is going to launch. And this is going to go and do all of the necessary pieces. So it's going to go and check the prerequisites are configured correctly, and if they're not, it's going to go and it's going to install the prerequisites that SAP Business One needs to work effectively. So I'll give that a couple of seconds to complete, and then you'll see the application, the installation will automatically move on to the next step. So I'll say next. And unlike the installation of the client that happened during the server install, when I selected to install the client at the same time as the server on my SQL Server box, this client-only installation is going to ask us a few more questions. All right. So we're just going to answer these questions. Specify your destination folder, and again, as you'll see, this is going to go into, and I'll just go back one step, this is going to go into your program files folder. So that's how I know that this is a 64-bit install. If it was a 32-bit install, it would be putting it into the program files x86 folder. Alright, so good way of checking, just so you know that you are installing the 64-bit client. Of course, the other way of doing that is opening your eyes a little bit wider, and there you'll see up the top it's telling you that it's the 64-bit installation. But anyway, it's always good to know some of these things. So we're going to put it into our SAP Business One folder, and then we're going to say next. And we're going to let the installation run. Now, when you're installing on remote desktop services, like the instructions say, you do not want to click the finish or cancel button until the installation has finished and completed successfully. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I like to do, I don't just wait for it to finish. I will go and run the application at least once before I hit the finish, and then that way any of those last minute setups that are done by the client will also be captured in the installation process. Okay, so we're just going to let that run. I'll stop talking and then we'll come back as soon as the process is finished. So you can see the system's now configuring all the system registry values. Now this is why it's very, very important when you're installing on a remote desktop services host that you do utilize this this special installation mechanism, because otherwise all of this work that's being done, registering the modules and so on and so forth, when different users log on, they don't actually get all the correct settings allocated to their application. So that can then cause problems. The user that was used to install the software is fine, but everybody else runs into problems. So that's it. Our application's now installed, so I'll say finish, and fundamentally that's it. What you could do is, if you wanted to, you could just go in here and hit finish on the admin install. But as I said, I always like to go and run the application at least once before I do that, to allow the system to go and do any configuration that it needs to. So it's going to spin up the SAP Business One for the very first time, and all things being equal, the system is going to read all of the necessary parameters from the SAP Business One client agent that was installed in the background for us. So the very first thing it's going to ask you is, okay, whereabouts did you configure the system landscape directory? And it's going to default that to localhost. But remember, in our particular instance, it was installed on sbosql.smbsolutions.com.au, because remember, when we did our server installation, I always use fully qualified domain names for all of my server components. So I'll say OK to that, and it's usually port 30,000 unless you've changed it, which we don't recommend that you do. we recommend that you leave it with that particular company, or with that particular port rather. And then the next step is to log on for the very first time as manager with the password manager. Now if you just go manager here, it's going to throw an error because it doesn't know which company you're trying to log on to. So what you can do is you can click there on the change company option, and that will bring up the SAP Business One company selection screen for you, and then you can pick the specific company that you want to go into. So we're just going to start up the client, but there's an important piece that's missing here. Alright, and you're going to see exactly what that is in a second. So you're probably aware that when you first install SAP Business One, it creates a standard system user, which is manager, and the password is manager. So the very first time you log on, you can log on with that username and password. But what's going to happen here is it's not going to be able to find the license server, alright? And we're going to get an error message. Now I've left it that way because there's an important component to this that I wanted to show you as part of the installation on the server, because it is a common area that people will often run into, is that they forget to open up the necessary firewall ports on the server. So if you get this message, it's telling you the user code or the password is incorrect, and then you get your select company screen and it looks like this, okay, and then you'll get this message saying error while connecting with the license server, then it's a good chance that you haven't opened up the firewall port. So let's just go and take a look at how we do that. So I have my server running here, and you'll see I've been having a little bit of a play around with the Business One integration framework. So if I close down all of these screens, now what I want to do is I want to go in and configure my firewall. So the easiest way to do that is to right click on my network icon down here in the system tray. I go and open up my network and sharing center, and then I go down here and I click on Windows Firewall. Then I go up here and I choose Advanced Settings, and I want to open up a couple of ports for inbound traffic on this machine. So if I go here to Inbound Rules, you'll see I've got my SAP Business One rulers configured here, and if I look at my protocols and ports, you'll see I've got my port 443. I've already opened up port 30,000 and 30,010. Alright, that's because I'm going to use those when I show you how to configure B1I and the web browser client. But the license server is sitting on port 30,000. You also have to open up port 30,001. Alright, so I just add that extra port there, and then I'll say apply, and I'll say OK to that. Let's now minimize that down again, so we're back here into our SAP Business One installation. I'm going to hit cancel, and that's going to drop me back out of the system. I'm going to run it up again, and this time what you'll see when I go here and I choose change company, the system is now going to be able to communicate through the firewall through to my license server, and everything's going to be as I expect. So remember, I installed two demo databases, my Australian demo database and my US demo database, so I can pick whichever one I want. SBO Demo US, for example. Go up here, Manager and Manager, and you'll see there's my fully qualified domain name for the server, for my SQL Server, so everything's good, and I'll say OK. And our SAP Business One client will spin up, and to all intents and purposes, we're now good to go. Alright, demo data, you always remember it actually has demo data which the fiscal year needs to be corrected. Okay, so just say okay to that, and then you want to go and set up a new fiscal year. But effectively, your SAP Business One client is ready to go. So what it's also going to do is it's going to load the installer for any of the add-ons, and you'll see those installers running in the background, and you just see those messages. Now, this is part of the reason why it's always a good idea to not finish the remote desktop services installation piece until you've gone and run your SAP Business One client for the very first time. Alright, so when that's all done, as this has, you can then close that down. That's just our system messages log. We can see everything's okay. I don't have a formal license in here, so I've basically got a 30-day installation for just doing my demos and so on and so forth, but I am pretty much okay to go. Now, one other thing that you might want to take a look at before you're complete, or before you treat this as being finished, is you might want to go into your administration, go into your system initialization, and then you'll go to your general settings, okay, and you'll switch on your cockpit. Alright, and then you'll also want to enable your SAP Crystal dashboards. I'm going to say OK to that, and then update that as well. And you'll get this message that the setting will take effect next time you log on to SAP Business One. So that's all good. Now, that's enabling the cockpit for the entire company, but each user has to go and switch the cockpit on as well. So I'm going to go and I'm going to say, well, I want to enable my cockpit, and I'm going to remember my answer. This will kick in next time I start up my SAP Business One. Alright, so I'll accept that. I'll say OK to that, and then we're basically done. Our client is installed, and we are ready to go with SAP Business One. In our next video, we're actually going to take a look at installing and working with the browser client. So I'm going to install a standalone browser client on a machine, which will be handy for those of you who you might already be running SAP Business One. You haven't installed the browser client yet, but you're thinking now is a good time to give that a try or start to use it. So you'll probably end up wanting to do a standalone installation. So we'll cover off on that in our next video. Thanks.